A loophole. Mr. Gradgrind walked homeward from the school, in a state of considerable satisfaction. It was his school, and he intended it to be a model. He intended every child in it to be a model, just as the young Gradgrinds were all models. There were 5 young Gradgrinds, and they were models every one. They had been lectured at, from their tenderest years, coursed, like little hares. Almost as soon as they could run alone, they had been made to run to the lecture room. The first object with which they had an association, or of which they had a remembrance, was a large blackboard with a dry ogre chalking ghastly white figures on it. Not that they knew, by name or nature, anything about an ogre, fact forbid. I only use the word to express a monster in a lecturing castle, with heaven knows how many heads manipulated into one, taking childhood captive, and dragging it into gloomy statistical dens by the hair. No little Gradgrind had ever seen a face in the moon, it was up in the moon before it could speak distinctly. No little Gradgrind had ever learnt the silly jingle, "Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are." No little Gradgrind had ever known wonder on the subject, each little Gradgrind having at 5 years old dissected the Great Bear like a Professor Owen, and driven Charles's Wain like a locomotive engine driver. No little Gradgrind had ever associated a cow in a field with that famous cow with the crumpled horn who tossed the dog who worried the cat who killed the rat who ate the malt, or with that yet more famous cow who swallowed Tom Thumb. It had never heard of those celebrities, and had only been introduced to a cow as a graminivorous ruminating quadruped with several stomachs. To his matter-of-fact home, which was called Stone Lodge, Mr. Gradgrind directed his steps. He had virtually retired from the wholesale hardware trade before he built Stone Lodge, and was now looking about for a suitable opportunity of making an arithmetical figure in Parliament. Stone Lodge was situated on a moor within a mile or two of a great town, called Coketown in the present faithful guide-book. A very regular feature on the face of the country, Stone Lodge was. Not the least disguise toned down or shaded off that uncompromising fact in the landscape. A great square house, with a heavy portico darkening the principal windows, as its master's heavy brows overshadowed his eyes. A calculated, cast-up, balanced, and proved house. Six windows on this side of the door, 6 on that side, a total of 12 in this wing, a total of 12 in the other wing, 4 and 20 carried over to the back wings. A lawn and garden and an infant avenue, all ruled straight like a botanical account book. Gas and ventilation, drainage and water service, all of the primmest quality. Iron clamps and girders, fireproof from top to bottom, mechanical lifts for the housemaids, with all their brushes and brooms, everything that heart could desire. Everything? Well, I suppose so. The little Gradgrinds had cabinets in various departments of science too. They had a little conchological cabinet, and a little metallurgical cabinet, and a little mineralogical cabinet, and the specimens were all arranged and labeled, and the bits of stone and ore looked as though they might have been broken from the parent substances by those tremendously hard instruments their own names, and, to paraphrase the idle legend of Peter Piper, who had never found his way into their nursery, if the greedy little Gradgrinds grasped at more than this, what was it for good gracious goodness sake, that the greedy little Gradgrinds grasped it? Their father walked on in a hopeful and satisfied frame of mind. He was an affectionate father, after his manner, but he would probably have described himself, if he had been put, like Sissy Jupe, upon a definition, as an eminently practical father. He had a particular pride in the phrase eminently practical, which was considered to have a special application to him. Whatsoever the public meeting held in Coketown, and whatsoever the subject of such meeting, some Coketowner was sure to seize the occasion of alluding to his eminently practical friend Gradgrind. This always pleased the eminently practical friend. He knew it to be his due, but his due was acceptable. He had reached the neutral ground upon the outskirts of the town, which was neither town nor country, and yet was either spoiled, when his ears were invaded by the sound of music. The clashing and banging band attached to the horse-riding establishment, which had there set up its rest in a wooden pavilion, was in full bray. A flag, floating from the summit of the temple, proclaimed to mankind that it was Sleary's horse riding which claimed their suffrages. Sleary himself, a stout modern statue with a money box at its elbow, in an ecclesiastical niche of early Gothic architecture, took the money. Miss Josephine Sleary, as some very long and very narrow strips of printed bill announced, was then inaugurating the entertainments with her graceful equestrian Tyrolean flower act. Among the other pleasing but always strictly moral wonders which must be seen to be believed, Signor Jupe was that afternoon to elucidate the diverting accomplishments of his highly trained performing dog Merrylegs. He was also to exhibit his astounding feat of throwing 75 hundredweight in rapid succession back-handed over his head, thus forming a fountain of solid iron in mid-air, a feat never before attempted in this or any other country, and which having elicited such rapturous plaudits from enthusiastic throngs it cannot be withdrawn. The same Signor Jupe was to enliven the varied performances at frequent intervals with his chaste Shakespearean quips and retorts. Lastly, he was to wind them up by appearing in his favourite character of Mr. William Button, of Tooley Street, in the highly novel and laughable Hippo Comedietta of The Tailor's Journey to Brentford. Thomas Gradgrind took no heed of these trivialities of course, but passed on as a practical man ought to pass on, either brushing the noisy insects from his thoughts, or consigning them to the house of correction. But, the turning of the road took him by the back of the booth, and at the back of the booth a number of children were congregated in a number of stealthy attitudes, striving to peep in at the hidden glories of the place. This brought him to a stop. "Now, to think of these vagabonds," said he, attracting the young rabble from a model school. A space of stunted grass and dry rubbish being between him and the young rabble, he took his eyeglass out of his waistcoat to look for any child he knew by name, and might order off. Phenomenon almost incredible though distinctly seen, what did he then behold but his own metallurgical Louisa, peeping with all her might through a hole in a deal board, and his own mathematical Thomas abasing himself on the ground to catch but a hoof of the graceful equestrian Tyrolean flower act. Dumb with amazement, Mr. Gradgrind crossed to the spot where his family was thus disgraced, laid his hand upon each erring child, and said, Louisa. Thomas. Both rose, red and disconcerted. But Louisa looked at her father with more boldness than Thomas did. Indeed, Thomas did not look at him, but gave himself up to be taken home like a machine. In the name of wonder, idleness, and folly, said Mr. Gradgrind, leading each away by a hand, what do you do here? Wanted to see what it was like, returned Louisa, shortly. What it was like? Yes, father. There was an air of jaded sullenness in them both, and particularly in the girl, yet, struggling through the dissatisfaction of her face, there was a light with nothing to rest upon, a fire with nothing to burn, a starved imagination keeping life in itself somehow, which brightened its expression. Not with the brightness natural to cheerful youth, but with uncertain, eager, doubtful flashes, which had something painful in them, analogous to the changes on a blind face groping its way. She was a child now, of 15 or 16, but at no distant day would seem to become a woman all at once. Her father thought so as he looked at her. She was pretty. Would have been self-willed, he thought in his eminently practical way, but for her bringing up. Thomas, though I have the fact before me, I find it difficult to believe that you, with your education and resources, should have brought your sister to a scene like this. I brought him, father, said Louisa, quickly. I asked him to come. I am sorry to hear it. I am very sorry indeed to hear it. It makes Thomas no better, and it makes you worse, Louisa. She looked at her father again, but no tear fell down her cheek. You Thomas and you, to whom the circle of the sciences is open, Thomas and you, who may be said to be replete with facts, Thomas and you, who have been trained to mathematical exactness, Thomas and you, here, cried Mr. Gradgrind. In this degraded position, I am amazed. I was tired, father. I have been tired a long time, said Louisa. Tired? Of what? Asked the astonished father. I don't know of what, of everything, I think. Say not another word, returned Mr. Gradgrind. You are childish. I will hear no more. He did not speak again until they had walked some half a mile in silence, when he gravely broke out with, "What would your best friends say, Louisa?" Do you attach no value to their good opinion? What would Mr. Bounderby say? At the mention of this name, his daughter stole a look at him, remarkable for its intense and searching character. He saw nothing of it, for before he looked at her, she had again cast down her eyes. What, he repeated presently, would Mr. Bounderby say? All the way to Stone Lodge, as with grave indignation he led the two delinquents home, he repeated at intervals, "What would Mr. Bounderby say?" as if Mr. Bounderby had been Mrs. Grundy. Mr. Bounderby. Not being Mrs. Grundy, who was Mr. Bounderby? Why, Mr. Bounderby was as near being Mr. Gradgrind's bosom friend, as a man perfectly devoid of sentiment can approach that spiritual relationship towards another man perfectly devoid of sentiment. So near was Mr. Bounderby, or, if the reader should prefer it, so far off. He was a rich man, banker, merchant, manufacturer, and what not. A big, loud man, with a stare, and a metallic laugh. A man made out of a coarse material, which seemed to have been stretched to make so much of him. A man with a great puffed head and forehead, swelled veins in his temples, and such a strained skin to his face that it seemed to hold his eyes open, and lift his eyebrows up. A man with a pervading appearance on him of being inflated like a balloon, and ready to start. A man who could never sufficiently vaunt himself a self-made man. A man who was always proclaiming, through that brassy speaking trumpet of a voice of his old ignorance and his old poverty. A man who was the bully of humility. A year or two younger than his eminently practical friend, Mr. Bounderby looked older. His 7 or 8 and 40 might have had the 7 or 8 added to it again, without surprising anybody. He had not much hair. One might have fancied he had talked it off, and that what was left, all standing up in disorder, was in that condition from being constantly blown about by his windy boastfulness. In the formal drawing-room of Stone Lodge, standing on the hearthrug, warming himself before the fire, Mr. Bounderby delivered some observations to Mrs. Gradgrind on the circumstance of its being his birthday. He stood before the fire, partly because it was a cool spring afternoon, though the sun shone, partly because the shade of Stone Lodge was always haunted by the ghost of damp mortar, partly because he thus took up a commanding position, from which to subdue Mrs. Gradgrind. I hadn't a shoe to my foot. As to a stocking, I didn't know such a thing by name. I passed the day in a ditch, and the night in a pigsty. That's the way I spent my 10th birthday. Not that a ditch was new to me, for I was born in a ditch. Mrs. Gradgrind, a little, thin, white, pink-eyed bundle of shawls, of surpassing feebleness, mental and bodily, who was always taking physic without any effect, and who, whenever she showed a symptom of coming to life, was invariably stunned by some weighty piece of fact tumbling on her. Mrs. Gradgrind hoped it was a dry ditch. No. As wet as a sop. A foot of water in it, said Mr. Bounderby. Enough to give a baby cold, Mrs. Gradgrind considered. Cold. I was born with inflammation of the lungs, and of everything else, I believe, that was capable of inflammation, returned Mr. Bounderby. For years, ma'am, I was one of the most miserable little wretches ever seen. I was so sickly, that I was always moaning and groaning. I was so ragged and dirty, that you wouldn't have touched me with a pair of tongs. Mrs. Gradgrind faintly looked at the tongs, as the most appropriate thing her imbecility could think of doing. "How I fought through it, I don't know," said Bounderby. "I was determined, I suppose." "I have been a determined character in later life, and I suppose I was then." "Here I am, Mrs. Gradgrind, anyhow, and nobody to thank for my being here, but myself." Mrs. Gradgrind meekly and weakly hoped that his mother "My mother bolted, ma'am," said Bounderby. Mrs. Gradgrind, stunned as usual, collapsed and gave it up. "My mother left me to my grandmother," said Bounderby, "and, according to the best of my remembrance, my grandmother was the wickedest and the worst old woman that ever lived." "If I got a little pair of shoes by any chance, she would take 'em off and sell 'em for drink." "Why, I have known that grandmother of mine lie in her bed and drink her 14 glasses of liquor before breakfast." Mrs. Gradgrind, weakly smiling, and giving no other sign of vitality, looked, as she always did, like an indifferently executed transparency of a small female figure, without enough light behind it. "She kept a chandler's shop," pursued Bounderby, "and kept me in an egg box." "That was the cot of my infancy, an old egg box." "As soon as I was big enough to run away, of course I ran away." "Then I became a young vagabond, and instead of one old woman knocking me about and starving me, everybody of all ages knocked me about and starved me." "They were right, they had no business to do anything else." "I was a nuisance, an encumbrance, and a pest." "I know that very well." His pride in having at any time of his life achieved such a great social distinction as to be a nuisance, an encumbrance, and a pest, was only to be satisfied by 3 sonorous repetitions of the boast. "I was to pull through it, I suppose, Mrs. Gradgrind." Whether I was to do it or not, ma'am, I did it. I pulled through it, though nobody threw me out a rope. Vagabond, errand boy, vagabond, laborer, porter, clerk, chief manager, small partner, Josiah Bounderby of Coketown. Those are the antecedents, and the culmination. Josiah Bounderby of Coketown learnt his letters from the outsides of the shops, Mrs. Gradgrind, and was first able to tell the time upon a dial plate from studying the steeple clock of St. Giles's Church, London, under the direction of a drunken cripple, who was a convicted thief, and an incorrigible vagrant. Tell Josiah Bounderby of Coketown, of your district schools and your model schools, and your training schools, and your whole kettle of fish of schools, and Josiah Bounderby of Coketown tells you plainly, all right, all correct, he hadn't such advantages, but let us have hard-headed, solid-fisted people, the education that made him won't do for everybody, he knows well, such and such his education was, however, and you may force him to swallow boiling fat, but you shall never force him to suppress the facts of his life. Being heated when he arrived at this climax, Josiah Bounderby of Coketown stopped. He stopped just as his eminently practical friend, still accompanied by the two young culprits, entered the room. His eminently practical friend, on seeing him, stopped also, and gave Louisa a reproachful look that plainly said, "Behold your Bounderby." "Well," blustered Mr. Bounderby, "what's the matter?" "What is young Thomas in the dumps about?" He spoke of young Thomas, but he looked at Louisa. "We were peeping at the circus," muttered Louisa, haughtily, without lifting up her eyes, "and father caught us." "And, Mrs. Gradgrind," said her husband in a lofty manner, "I should as soon have expected to find my children reading poetry." "Dear me," whimpered Mrs. Gradgrind. "How can you, Louisa and Thomas?" "I wonder at you. I declare you're enough to make one regret ever having had a family at all." "I have a great mind to say I wish I hadn't." "Then what would you have done, I should like to know?" Mr. Gradgrind did not seem favorably impressed by these cogent remarks. He frowned impatiently. As if, with my head in its present throbbing state, you couldn't go and look at the shells and minerals and things provided for you, instead of circuses, said Mrs. Gradgrind. You know, as well as I do, no young people have circus masters, or keep circuses in cabinets, or attend lectures about circuses. What can you possibly want to know of circuses then? I am sure you have enough to do, if that's what you want. With my head in its present state, I couldn't remember the mere names of half the facts you have got to attend to. That's the reason, pouted Louisa. Don't tell me that's the reason, because it can't be nothing of the sort, said Mrs. Gradgrind. Go and be something logical directly. Mrs. Gradgrind was not a scientific character, and usually dismissed her children to their studies with this general injunction to choose their pursuit. In truth, Mrs. Gradgrind's stock of facts in general was woefully defective, but Mr. Gradgrind, in raising her to her high matrimonial position, had been influenced by two reasons. Firstly, she was most satisfactory as a question of figures, and, secondly, she had no nonsense about her. By nonsense he meant fancy, and truly it is probable she was as free from any alloy of that nature, as any human being not arrived at the perfection of an absolute idiot, ever was. The simple circumstance of being left alone with her husband and Mr. Bounderby, was sufficient to stun this admirable lady again without collision between herself and any other fact. So, she once more died away, and nobody minded her. "Bounderby," said Mr. Gradgrind, drawing a chair to the fireside, "you are always so interested in my young people, particularly in Louisa, that I make no apology for saying to you, I am very much vexed by this discovery." I have systematically devoted myself, as you know, to the education of the reason of my family. The reason is, as you know, the only faculty to which education should be addressed. and yet, Bounderby, it would appear from this unexpected circumstance of today, though in itself a trifling one, as if something had crept into Thomas's and Louisa's minds which is, or rather, which is not, I don't know that I can express myself better than by saying, which has never been intended to be developed, and in which their reason has no part. There certainly is no reason in looking with interest at a parcel of vagabonds, returned Bounderby. When I was a vagabond myself, nobody looked with any interest at me, I know that. Then comes the question, said the eminently practical father, with his eyes on the fire, in what has this vulgar curiosity its rise? I'll tell you in what. In idle imagination. I hope not, said the eminently practical. I confess, however, that the misgiving has crossed me on my way home. In idle imagination, Gradgrind, repeated Bounderby. A very bad thing for anybody, but a cursed bad thing for a girl like Louisa. I should ask Mrs. Gradgrind's pardon for strong expressions, but that she knows very well I am not a refined character. Whoever expects refinement in me will be disappointed. I hadn't a refined bringing up. Whether, said Gradgrind, pondering with his hands in his pockets, and his cavernous eyes on the fire, whether any instructor or servant can have suggested anything. Whether Louisa or Thomas can have been reading anything. Whether, in spite of all precautions, any idle story-book can have got into the house. Because, in minds that have been practically formed by rule and line, from the cradle upwards, this is so curious, so incomprehensible. Stop a bit, cried Bounderby, who all this time had been standing, as before, on the hearth, bursting at the very furniture of the room with explosive humility. You have one of those strollers' children in the school. Cecilia Jupe, by name, said Mr. Gradgrind, with something of a stricken look at his friend. Now, stop a bit, cried Bounderby again. How did she come there? Why, the fact is, I saw the girl myself, for the first time, only just now. she specially applied here at the house to be admitted, as not regularly belonging to our town, and, yes, you are right, Bounderby, you are right. Now, stop a bit, cried Bounderby, once more. Louisa saw her when she came. Louisa certainly did see her, for she mentioned the application to me. But Louisa saw her, I have no doubt, in Mrs. Gradgrind's presence. Pray, Mrs. Gradgrind, said Bounderby, what passed? Oh, my poor health, returned Mrs. Gradgrind. The girl wanted to come to the school, and Mr. Gradgrind wanted girls to come to the school, and Louisa and Thomas both said that the girl wanted to come, and that Mr. Gradgrind wanted girls to come, and how was it possible to contradict them when such was the fact? Now I tell you what, Gradgrind, said Mr. Bounderby. Turn this girl to the right about, and there's an end of it. I am much of your opinion. Do it at once, said Bounderby, has always been my motto from a child. When I thought I would run away from my egg box and my grandmother, I did it at once. Do you the same. Do this at once. Are you walking? Asked his friend. I have the father's address. Perhaps you would not mind walking to town with me? Not the least in the world, said Mr. Bounderby, as long as you do it at once. So, Mr. Bounderby threw on his hat. He always threw it on, as expressing a man who had been far too busily employed in making himself, to acquire any fashion of wearing his hat, and with his hands in his pockets, sauntered out into the hall. I never wear gloves, it was his custom to say. I didn't climb up the ladder in 'em. Shouldn't be so high up, if I had. Being left to saunter in the hall a minute or two while Mr. Gradgrind went upstairs for the address, he opened the door of the children's study and looked into that serene floor-clothed apartment, which, notwithstanding its bookcases and its cabinets and its variety of learned and philosophical appliances, had much of the genial aspect of a room devoted to hair-cutting. Louisa languidly leaned upon the window looking out, without looking at anything, while young Thomas stood sniffing revengefully at the fire. Adam Smith and Malthus, two younger gradgrinds, were out at lecture in custody, and little Jane, after manufacturing a good deal of moist pipe clay on her face with slate pencil and tears, had fallen asleep over vulgar fractions. "It's all right now, Louisa, it's all right, young Thomas," said Mr. Bounderby, "you won't do so any more." "I'll answer for its being all over with father." "Well, Louisa, that's worth a kiss, isn't it?" "You can take one, Mr. Bounderby," returned Louisa, when she had coldly paused, and slowly walked across the room, and ungraciously raised her cheek towards him, with her face turned away. "Always my pet, ain't you, Louisa?" said Mr. Bounderby. "Goodbye, Louisa." He went his way, but she stood on the same spot, rubbing the cheek he had kissed, with her handkerchief, until it was burning red. She was still doing this, 5 minutes afterwards. "What are you about, Lou?" her brother sulkily remonstrated. "You'll rub a hole in your face." "You may cut the piece out with your penknife if you like, Tom." "I wouldn't cry."